Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. It is Tuesday. I want to thank Penna Dexter for sitting in for me yesterday while I had some other activities I was involved with. And we're going to spend some time in this first hour looking at a couple of things happening here in the state of Texas. And one of those has to do with the Texas voting machines. You've probably seen some stories about it, and I thought I'd try to clear up some of the miscommunication involved with that and some of the concerns that have surfaced. And so we'll focus on that. One of the other things I thought I would talk about today, and we'll get into it more tomorrow, is the decision by the president to actually challenge the idea of birthright citizenship. Something I'll talk about, something I've written about before, but also tomorrow, Nick Pitts and I might even do a point-counterpoint debate on that to help you get into it in a little more detail. One of the other articles I've posted here, Not All Radicals Are the Same, the attempt to explain both of, and maybe the word explain is not strong enough, to blame the president for both of the situations, the mail bombing bomber, if you will, the mail bomber, as well as the one individual that attacked the Pittsburgh synagogue, is a little bit off target, and David French helps us with that. Another piece here on The Left Goes Open Borders, which has been amazing to me, given the fact that even a fair number of people who would identify themselves as Democrats would say, well, we still need to have borders, and now this open borders idea has really sort of taken hold in some of the Democratic leadership. And while we talk about, and I mentioned the idea of the Pittsburgh synagogue, I do want to talk about that, but I'm kind of waiting for the next hour to do that. We will have with us Scott Shay. He is the author of this new book, In Good Faith, who actually, interesting enough, is Jewish, but really makes some very powerful arguments for the existence of God from a Jewish point of view. And so oftentimes you hear us talk about arguments for the existence of God from a Christian perspective. He's going to look at it, obviously, from a Jewish perspective, but I think still very helpful to those of us that, of course, value the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And more importantly, because of that, one of his chapters deals with why does evil happen to God's people, which is chapter 19 in his book, and we'll certainly use that to get into the discussion about the killing in the Pittsburgh synagogue, which is, most people consider, the greatest massacre of Jews in the history of America. So we'll get into some of that a little bit later in the next hour. For those of you that like to listen to all 3 hours, I might just mention Jerry Newcombe with us. His book is American Amnesia, and it's a collection of his essays, but again, at a time when we recognize that less than 1 in 5 individuals under the age of 45 could pass the citizenship test for citizenship here in the United States. We certainly have a great deal of amnesia. Of course, amnesia assumes you knew it in the first place and forgot it. Maybe for America's forgotten it, but a lot of them never learned it in the first place. So we'll get into that and all sorts of other topics related to it as well. But let's get into this. So one of the first articles I've posted comes from Western Journal. Texas voters come forward, reveal shocking machine malfunction. And according to one news station that was covering this, they said voters of both parties are complaining about having their ballots mismarked by voting machines. A lot of these have to do with a particular kind of voting machine, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. But let's take one Houston voter who reported the problem as she tried to vote a straight ticket, Democratic ticket. On the last screen, she noticed a vote that should have been for Beto O'Rourke and was instead marked for Ted Cruz. This happened the other way as well. Republicans had a different result. Voters who would select a straight party Republican ticket saw that in some cases it would unselect Senator Ted Cruz and end up voting for no one. So either way, this is as the news station talked about, a rare circumstance, but it is one that is very troubling. And more importantly, there is an op-ed that came out a couple of months ago, one that I've talked about before, that came in the Texas Tribune, which said that Texans have known about some of the problems with the voting technology, have been calling for improvements, and have not seen them. Now, let's just think about this for a minute. We would not put up with this kind of technological glitch anywhere else. If you, for example, went to your ATM machine, and you can both take money out of an ATM machine and put it in. Let's say you take some money out, and then later the bank finds that it didn't take it out of your account, but it came from maybe your neighbor's account. They'd be reasonably upset. If you tried to make a deposit and put it in on the machine and it ended up going to somebody with a different last name, but not you, you'd be upset. And then if you found out that that had existed for years, first of all, there'd be a lawsuit. Second of all, somebody probably would go to jail. And this, I think, is my illustration of some of the concerns I have with the lack of voter integrity here in America. These kinds of glitches have been known for many years, and we aren't solving them. Now, there is an answer to this, and it comes from the Secretary of State's department, which actually shows that these particular voting machines, and they're the Hart E-Slate voting machine, there is a bit of a glitch. It's not a major one, but it's enough to cause you a problem, especially in the U.S. Senate race, and that is this. When you get on your machine, you have a button that allows you to vote, but then you have a wheel on the right-hand side that allows you to move up and down. What has been happening is sometimes people are moving the wheel while they're pushing the button, and that's why in some cases it will deselect. And so it's not, they said, that they're malfunctioning. It's that this is user error. Well, maybe. It's still a problem, because, first of all, can we come up with a ballot that doesn't require you to move up and down? I think this is not that complicated. You have all probably, if you've had any kind of computer expertise at all, if you've tried to help somebody else with their computer, I'll use my wife as an example, but sometimes she'll say, I can't see it. It's not on the screen. I said, well, on the right-hand side, see that slider? Slide it down and you'll see it. Well, that's exactly what we have with these voting machines. Slide it down. Well, can't we just do it so that you don't have to slide them up and down? That, I think, eliminates this particular problem where you use the selection wheel on the right-hand side and some people actually start voting. The other problem that has surfaced is where people start voting before the entire screen refreshes. Again, those of us that deal with sophisticated computers and we look at these clunky voting machines go, seriously, can't we do a little better than this? And the fact that we've known this for years, I think, is a reason for outrage. So, nevertheless, the bottom line is this. First of all, when you go in, if you have not already gone in to vote, when you go in, make sure that after you have selected those individuals, if you have one of those Hart E-Slate voting machines, at the very end, it pops those up, and then look and see if there has been any problem before you enter it and vote. So that's the first thing. So make sure you check and recheck your ballot. After all, you would do that with a paper ballot. Oh, there's a concept. Well, we go back to paper ballots. When you mess up a machine, you're not sure what you've messed up, and you don't have any assurance, you don't have any way of going back and checking that. With a paper ballot, yes, you do. So I'm thinking that's one of those issues that certainly would be a solution. But then if indeed you are convinced that there is a misfunction or a malfunction, I think what you should say in a loud enough voice so that not only the workers in the poll place can hear you, but the election judge can hear you saying, my machine does not seem to be working effectively. It's not giving me the right vote. Maybe you'll get some action, and then we'll have a chance to fix it. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Senator Ben Sasse writes in his new book about the vanishing American adult, our coming-of-age crisis, and how to rebuild a culture of self-reliance. He recently took some material from the book and wrote about what happens when we don't raise kids to become adults. He tells the story of being tapped to become president of Midland University at the age of 37 years old. The board of directors did so because Ben Sasse has the reputation as a turnaround guy who specializes in helping troubled companies become solvent. The university certainly needed his help. They were on the verge of missing payroll 4 months in a row, but he soon discovered that finances might not have been the biggest problem at the school. One student, for example, staged a sit-in at the president's office and announced that he would not leave until the president resolved the scheduling problem for him. He was upset that the registrar wouldn't be offering a particular course he needed the following semester. When Ben Sasse engaged the student in conversation, he proclaimed, "You need to figure this out. I pay tuition to go to this school, which means I pay your salary, so you work for me." The university conducted annual surveys about student experience on campus. It not only showed their lack of a work ethic, but a lack of understanding of the difference between production and consumption. The activities they said they enjoyed most were sleeping in, skipping classes, and partying. A few mentioned canceled classes as the best part of their 4 years. I hope that some of these examples seem crazy to you. Unfortunately, for many in this emerging generation, these attitudes seem just about right. That is why Ben Sasse wants to remind these young people that growing up involves maturity, hard work, and even delayed gratification. If not, we'll have a country of perpetual kids. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Graceworks Pictures, Indivisible, based on the true story of Army Chaplain Darren Turner and his wife Heather. Rated PG-13. Now playing. IndivisibleMovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just want to talk for another minute or two about elections. And, of course, if you just joined us, and just a few minutes ago, I spent some time talking about the fact that there have been some reports from both sides, although oftentimes it seems to be happening to Republican voters, but we have at least one Democrat voter in Houston that reported in this particular case where she voted straight ticket Democrat, and it was marked for Ted Cruz instead of Beto O'Rourke. And we have, of course, some others that I mentioned, probably quite a few that we've run into, where Republicans wanted to vote straight ticket, and it seemed to unselect Senator Ted Cruz. So what's going on? As I pointed out, the argument coming from the Secretary of State's department and office here in the state of Texas is that this is an error from the voters, not the machine. Technically true, but very misleading, because the machines are actually constructed in such a way that when an individual selecting candidates moving the wheel, if you move that wheel while you're actually pushing a button, it can sometimes deselect a particular candidate. Or if you try to select your candidates before the screen is completely populated, which isn't usually a problem, but if somebody's really fast on the draw, that causes a problem as well. So, yes, it's user error, but it's a problem that we don't face with our computers in our homes. Is that a fair way to put it? And so as a result, the bottom line is, I think it is important for you to check and recheck your ballot before you vote if you have one of these Hart E-Slate voting machines. I think there's another solution. I mean, I know people hate paper ballots, but it's real easy to figure out when you have that paper ballot and you run it through there. We actually have a physical record. If some time later we wonder whether or not we actually had any kind of mischief taking place in that particular election location. So that's something to think about, but nevertheless, there's where we find ourselves right now. But while I'm talking about this, is certainly, of course, we've had the Secretary of State's office saying this phenomenon is caused by a voter taking an action on the machine rather than a programming error. Okay. They went on to say the Secretary of State's office has observed a disturbing trend where misinformation is being spread regarding the scale and the impact of these reported incidences. That's the thing. When you hear these stories, sometimes it sounds like it's happening everywhere, and there's only a few individuals that have reported it. But while we're looking at some of the election issues, since we broadcast today from the area of the Dallas County, right now you have a situation in which there are people complaining that Dallas County's Democrats were blocking access to the mail ballot review process. So that's been one of those questions that's been asked. Also, there are some that have said that Republican poll watchers who have wanted to take notes and observe the mail ballot review have been prevented to do so. And so there's some arguments that that's a violation of the Texas election code. And then we also have, as I have liked to document from time to time, a number of court cases where people who have been voting illegally have been charged and actually punished. You know, you always hear the argument, we really don't need voter ID because this is an issue just dreamed up by a number of people that are trying to prevent minorities from voting. Okay, well, let's look at this, for example. You have the Attorney General's office is investigating the Texas Democratic Party for mailing voter registration forms to ineligible non-citizens that were pre-filled to indicate that the applicants were U.S. citizens. That's a violation of the law. We have a non-citizen who was illegally voting in 3 presidential elections in Harris County who pled guilty this month to voter fraud and will be deported after serving her jail time. But first we are putting that woman in jail, and then we're deporting her. Then you have another non-citizen who's been living illegally in Bexar County for years and has been voting illegally there since at least, the guess is, since 1994, and pled guilty this week to federal fraud charges. So when we look at these elections, these surface every single time we have an election. I like to bring those stories to you because some of them make it their way into the news. Oftentimes they do not. And it's real easy to argue that we don't need voter ID because the argument is, when do you ever hear about anybody that's even been charged, much less prosecuted, for illegally voting? Well, you just heard a couple I just put on the table that just happened within the last month. Let's move on, though. One of the big issues today is an interview that Axios did with Donald Trump, and they brought up the fact that he was actually going to sign an executive order challenging the issue of birthright citizenship. And first of all, he said, I'm really surprised. How did you know this? I didn't know anybody knew about that. The issue is simply this. We have a situation now that even if you're here illegally, if your child is born here, that child is considered automatically an American citizen based upon a particular interpretation of the 14th Amendment. So that oftentimes that child has been called an anchor baby, although some people see that as a derogatory term, but that's the term that's sometimes been used. And then because that baby has citizenship, you can sometimes then get what's called chain migration. After all, you wouldn't want to separate the parents from the child that's an actual American citizen, so it opens up the possibility of chain migration. Okay, well, anyway, President Donald Trump is on Axios, on HBO, and he said, it was always told me that you needed a constitutional amendment, that is, to actually challenge this issue of birthright citizenship. He says, guess what? You don't. Well, immediately there's pushback from the interviewer who obviously brought it up and had done at least some research on that. And he said, well, I don't think that's the case. And so Trump said, well, you can definitely do it with an act of Congress, but now they're saying I can do it with an executive order. Then Donald Trump waded into the weeds in a way that he shouldn't have, because he said, we're the only country in the world where a person comes in and has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States with all those benefits. Wrong. Okay. the bottom line is this particular article suggests that there are 30 countries. I have seen a lot of countries that do not provide that, but I'll leave that at its at the moment. And so what you have here is a situation in which, because this has been a useful technique between 1980 and 2006, for which we have some pretty good numbers, the number of births to unauthorized immigrants or illegal aliens, whatever phrase you want to use, undocumented workers, actually has skyrocketed. It was a peak of 370,000 a year. In other words, more than 1/3 babies born here to those people who are here illegally, who thus then were given birthright citizenship and thus provided an opportunity perhaps for those that are here illegally to stay, because after all, we wouldn't separate families. This was why they're oftentimes referred to as anchor babies. Now, that number has dropped off since 2006 because, if nothing else, we've had the so-called Great Recession that took place in 2008. But nevertheless, it was a very significant number just a few years ago and could peak once again with the individuals coming here with their caravans. Now, how has the Supreme Court ruled on this? Well, the Supreme Court has ruled that children born to immigrants who are legal permanent residents have citizenship, but they've never really ruled on the other issue. And I've done some commentaries in the past on this. One commentary that came out a number of years ago based upon an article that appeared in the Texas Review of Law and Politics by a professor of law, University of Texas, that argued that the 14th Amendment itself was really just intended, as we know, to provide citizenship for those people who were brought here, if you will, illegally, the slave trade. Again, the 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdictions thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And so the argument is that these were indeed attempts to provide citizenship for slaves, but that's it. And the basis of the language really parallels what was called the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which made it very clear that it was providing citizenship to those people who were not subject to any foreign power. By definition, if you are from Mexico, Canada, Germany, India, China, whatever, you're still considered a citizen of that country and you're not in our jurisdiction. So that is an article and a commentary that I wrote about a couple of years ago. One that just came out in August, I brought up again because Michael Anton of Hillsdale College has also argued that citizenship should not be a birthright. And if anything, it was really the 14th Amendment was written simply to overturn the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision. And more importantly, the idea subject to the jurisdiction was not just subject to American law, because if that were the case, then a tourist who is here from another country has a child, well, then that would be a citizen, and nobody assumes that to be the case. So we will probably do kind of a point-counterpoint tomorrow. Nick Pitts is excited to do a debate with me, so we'll cover some of that right here on Point of View.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We will take your phone calls if you'd like. Certainly a little bit later we'll get into those as we talk with Scott Shay. We'll focus first on the whole subject of the massacre, the greatest massacre of Jews in American history that took place there in Pittsburgh. And we'll talk about that with him and also get more deeply into his book, In Good Faith, which really talks about arguments for the existence of God using logic and even kind of Jewish perspectives on that. I thought you would find that very fascinating. Then Jerry Newcombe will be with us in the third hour as we talk about his book, American Amnesia, and get into all sorts of issues related to this issue of immigration, birthright citizenship. We've already talked about the voter machines. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. A little bit later, I will check our Facebook Live post because some of you like to watch the program on Facebook Live, and you can leave a note there, and I'll talk about it in just a minute. Before I move on, let me just mention that just a minute ago, we were, of course, talking about this issue of birthright citizenship. You might say, well, why did the president bring it up right now? Okay, let's be honest, probably the election. I mean, after all, this is something Donald Trump spoke about when he was a candidate 2 years ago. Only now is he getting to that. Now, of course, his argument is this is not actually something he was going to reveal. Axios brought it up because they had interviewed some people with the White House who said he was considering it. So he honestly said, I'm surprised that the HBO knew about this. I didn't know anybody knew but me, but I thought I was the only one. Well, of course, you cannot keep a secret in the White House. So you can say that in some respects, he didn't necessarily intend for it to come out today, but it did. And is it going to help elections? I don't know. This is something he's talked about. Ann Coulter's written about it in her books and all the rest. But nevertheless, it's back to a really, I think, helpful discussion, which Nick Pitts and I will have tomorrow in the first hour because he likes to do kind of a point-counterpoint. So let's have at it. And as Jim Garrity says, some constitutional scholars argue that the phrase subject of the jurisdiction thereof would exclude illegal immigrants. After all, they're not subject to our jurisdiction because they're not in the country legally. Now, of course, if we were to ever overturn this particular interpretation, you really got some messy things, because what about the people that are citizens? Do we just say that after the date, let's say 2019, if you're born here, you're no longer a citizen? Or I think the obvious solution, if we ever were able to move down this road, would be to say that you're not automatically a citizen. In other words, in most cases, we would probably grant that, but consider a really bizarre situation where an MS-13 or a terrorist or drug dealer's wife gives birth here. We'd say, this is probably being used in a way to manipulate our system, so maybe we wouldn't grant it there. But it is, of course, a really important question. And when I wrote my piece that came out in August, I said the biggest challenge is the fact that there are conservatives that even come on this program, lawyers and constitutionalists and others, who say, no, I think that the way it's been interpreted, the 14th Amendment has been interpreted, is the way it should be interpreted. And James Ho, who we've quoted before, now as a Fifth Circuit Court, says it would be unconstitutional, he believes, to interpret it any other way. So if nothing else, Jim Garrity says we may get an assessment from the Supreme Court soon. An effort to overturn more than a century of precedent with an executive order is going to face an instant legal challenge. He says some group is probably writing up a request for a preliminary injunction as we speak. But who knows if the Supreme Court, even with Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh on it, will approve of a sweeping change to a long-standing policy done by executive order. The Supreme Court has upheld the executive branch having wide latitude on who to allow into this country, but denying citizenship to children born here would be a dramatic new step. I think it's going to be a tempest in a teapot. I think it's going to be something that will generate some conversation for some time. Don't see that it changes. Back to my favorite line that I used back in August, if I can quote myself to you for just a minute. I said, this current policy of the government is to actually believe that the 14th Amendment automatically grants citizenship to anyone born in this country, but a number of constitutional scholars disagree. I've written about this in the past, I say, and I want to focus on it again, but I've also noted that a number of conservative lawyers who have been on my radio program accept the government's policy. If you think the policy should be changed, I would recommend you start by convincing fellow conservatives and constitutionalists. It is amazing to me whenever you do have this discussion about birthright citizenship, there's a lot of hand waving. Oh, that's just ridiculous. Everybody believes that. And I've had it on both sides. I've had people say, I can't believe that we grant birthright citizenship. I go, well, yeah, but we have people that you and I know that vote with us, that agree with us, that disagree with that. Well, I don't know what's wrong with them. Or then when other people say, I can't even believe we're having this conversation. This was settled back in the 19th century when we passed the 14th Amendment. No, it wasn't. I mean, I can point you to some very significant precedents. You can read my articles to point out that in a few cases, they did not grant citizenship to people that were considered non-citizens. And there are some great examples of that. For example, in 1884, the Supreme Court ruled that children born to Indian parents were not subject to U.S. jurisdiction and thus were not actually citizens. And I can give you other examples, but nevertheless, it's not as clear as people might think, but there will be a lot of finger pointing and hand waving over the next couple of days. And if nothing else, you've had a chance to hear hopefully a little more in-depth and more intelligent discussion. Tomorrow we'll have another one of those with Nick Pitts. But before we end this hour, I think it would be good to remind ourselves of the fact that if you turn on a lot of the people, especially in cable news, but even in the so-called mainstream media, President Trump is blamed for every terrorist attack. President Trump is blamed for every shooting. President Trump is blamed for every particular massacre or incursion or whatever. And if nothing else, what I thought David French's piece was very balanced, because he said that last week we had a bona fide Trump superfan launching a campaign of terror against the people and entities that Trump repeatedly attacks, often with rhetoric that is over the top. Also last week, a man who hates Trump launched a dreadful attack against a synagogue, killing 11 Jewish Americans in the worst anti-Semitic attack in American history. It so happens that Trump's daughter, son-in-law, and 3 of his grandchildren are Jewish, and he's been a stalwart supporter of the nation of Israel. Yet, despite these dramatic differences, he points out several members of the media, and has a link to many of these examples, put blame on Trump for both attacks. And David French says that's a mistake. The attackers are different, their radicalization is different, and to allocate responsibility similarly doesn't just hinder our ability to respond effectively to radicals, but also needlessly angers Americans who rightly believe that their side is being unjustly blamed for a terrible crime. So David French goes into some detail by saying to understand the differences, it's necessary to discuss the concept of radicalization itself. It's a huge topic, one deserving book-length treatment, but I found it helpful to discuss radicalization as a process similar to religious conversion. Indeed, some radicalization actually involves a religious conversion. The result is a fundamental paradigm shift, a new way of looking at the world. He says it is vital to understand the distinct paradigm for each radical community. Each communities will share common enemies, can have different motivations, and thus demand different responses. Radicalization often begins with discontent and grievance, and the initial grievance need not be all that specific. A sense of purposelessness can create fertile ground for radicalism. So can despair from a broken family or a lost job. Radicalization involves a sense of forward momentum along with several fronts. The purposeless man gains a purpose. The lonely man gains a community. The ignorant man becomes enlightened. At the end of the process, the true radical sees the world so differently and filters news through such a warped prism that we can't apply any kind of conventional analysis of the way he views the world. And he points out that the male bomber's life seems to have followed this path. According to, he says, an interesting Washington Post profile, he lived an angry, purposeless life. He bounced from job to job. He lived out of his van. He told lies about himself. He falsely claimed to be a Seminole. He's Filipino and Italian. Falsely claimed to be a Chippendales dancer and fraudulently modified his driver's license to make himself look younger. Then in 2006, he found a home In the world of conservative trolls, he was radicalized specifically as a Trump cultist. And make no mistake, that world exists. When I saw the memes and threats that he sent to figures on Twitter, I immediately recognized the pattern. It's a simple fact that there exists a community of people operating mainly online that follows Trump with fanatical devotion and targets Trump's critics for campaigns of targeted harassment. It's also a simple fact that these individuals overlap heavily with the alt-right and the white nationalist community. Let me take a break. When we come back, I want to finish this off because he helps us understand the question that we all have. How did someone come to do such horrible acts? In this case, sending bombs. In the case of the synagogue, shooting up innocent citizens. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. America was saddened to learn of the loss of Billy Graham. Some have openly wondered whether history will ever witness another one like him. The better question to ask at this point in our history may be, can there be another Billy Graham? Graham's crusades were public expressions of faith, many times taking place on public property. In 1952, Graham's crusade visited Washington, D.C. Graham held services on the very steps of the United States Capitol, enlisting supportive government officials to secure the permission needed for such an event. He would go on to preach at dozens of the country's most historic and publicly owned venues, including what is today known as Camping World Stadium. In 2015, the football teams from two Christian schools in Florida faced off in that same stadium where, in 1969 and again in 1983, Billy Graham stood to share his gospel message with thousands in attendance. Incredibly, these two religious schools were denied use of the city-owned microphone to pray over the same loudspeaker once used to amplify the disarming baritone voice of Billy Graham as he preached and prayed. If the First Amendment does not protect the right of two Christian schools to pray for 30 seconds over a city-owned loudspeaker in 2015, can it protect the next Billy Graham who wants to use the same public address system in the same stadium? To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that the second article that we've posted today here on pointofview.net actually is one that is entitled, Not All Radicals Are the Same. And I appreciate David French, first of all, because he's a Christian, second of all, because he's a lawyer and has done a really good job of analyzing the community. But number three, because, you know, if you want to pick a never-Trumper, he was pretty close to it. I mean, this guy almost ran against Donald Trump as an independent. So when he looks at this, he's, I think, willing to say some things other people would not. And that is to talk about the fact that, let's face it, what you had with the bomb suspect or the bomber, or whatever you want to call him, was kind of a bona fide Trump superfan. And as he points out, You can go to some of these various websites and see that these are individuals who are so supportive of Donald Trump that any criticism of him results in blowback. And he goes on to say, talk virtually to any journalist or writer who's published negative stories about Trump or wrote critically about Trump, and they can tell you a similar story. They faced more vicious blowback from Trump superfans than they've ever encountered in their careers, including when they critiqued other politicians. And the blowback is often explicitly racist or anti-Semitic. So that is the case. And he said this is no secret. In fact, a very senior member of Trump's campaign team, Steve Bannon, used Breitbart to openly court and mainstream the alt-right. Make no mistake, he says, when Trump uses vicious rhetoric against his opponents, there are people around him who know exactly what that means. And so he talks about how, in some respects, we can understand the bomber or the bombing suspect. So he says when it comes to the bombing suspect, it is absolutely appropriate to explore this community that he was a part of. But then he goes on to the next point. But not all radicals are the same. Based on the available evidence, it's beyond a stretch to apply this same analysis to the Pittsburgh shooter. He wasn't radicalized in the Trump troll community, but into an older, even darker world of anti-Semitism that predates Trump and will sadly endure long after Trump is gone. The Pittsburgh shooter, he says, believes that Jews controlled Trump. On Gab, his online platform of choice, by the way, I just noticed Gab closed down just the other day, at least for the day, he mocked Trump and said he didn't vote for Trump and claimed he'd never owned, worn, or even touched a Make America Great hat. You can read his archived Gab post if you dare, and you'll see they're full of both vile and anti-Semitic images and posts from Jewish websites. He was obsessed with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. This man was so radicalized in his hatred for Jews that he could be whipped into a murderous rage by posts from the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society itself or by pictures of smiling American Jews welcoming refugees at airports. Against that background and that backdrop, it's simply a reach to claim that Trump's rhetoric or Fox News provoked this man to kill. This was a man so evil and vile that he could not look straight into the face of Jewish compassion or burn with his desire to kill. It's always important to be accurate, fair, and precise. It's especially important in our superheated political environment. It's one thing to claim that Trump should reckon with the fact that one of his superfans terrorized the very people whom Trump had targeted with absurdly overheated and vicious rhetoric. It's another thing to claim that Trump should reckon with the fact that someone who hates him murdered 11 members of a religious group that Trump has explicitly and intentionally supported with many of his policies and also includes members of his own family. I appreciate the comments there. I wish those kind of comments would show up on some of the talking head shows right now. As David French concludes, he says, these are different situations requiring different responses. Throwing them together has two negative consequences, one for the left and the other for the right. On the left, it can wrongly teach people that Trump is the root of more American evil than he is, which inflates his importance, also inflames American politics, and can dull the senses to other sources of danger. And when allegations of complicity in mass murder start to wrongly extend to larger Republican communities, we have the same kind of difficulty. On the right, he goes on to then say, on the right, it allows Trump supporters to tune out even valid critiques. After all, when Republicans know that Democrats and the media will always find a way to blame Trump, it leads to the reflexive defense and reflexive rejection of progressive allegations. Yet Trump's rhetoric is irresponsible, and so it goes in to talk about some of those comments as well. So the point he concludes with is, I believe that Trump has a role to play in tempering his community of radical supporters. I do not believe that Trump can touch the hatred and the heat of anti-Semitism like the Pittsburgh killer. The latter represents an ancient evil. The challenge there is far more complex, and we've never been able to fully tame the anti-Semitic darkness in too many human souls. As Jesus noted, he said, some demons are more difficult to dislodge than others, and the demon of anti-Semitism is among the most difficult of all to dislodge. I remember talking with somebody when I was in Israel the very first time, and we were just reflecting on the fact that anti-Semitism is probably one of the best illustrations, I think, of spiritual warfare. Because as the time we were traveling through Israel. And when you travel through Israel for the first time, you realize how small it is. I mean, we are talking about a country that is about the size of New Jersey. When you take out the Judean desert and some other places, you're talking about something that is a very small area indeed, which is the focus of all of the hatred and intent and anger of the entire Arab world. When you look at the vast land that the Arabs have to even be bothered by the fact that there are a few Jewish people in this land, which is done so well and has been completely brought out of kind of desolation into tremendous affluence and abundance, is amazing. And then, too, as this Pittsburgh shooter believes, that the world is controlled by the Jews. I mean, put this in perspective. What, you've got 7 billion people on this planet. You got 2 billion Christians, 1.5 billion Muslims, another billion Hindus and Buddhists, and all sorts of other individuals. You have at most 18 million Jewish people in the entire world, about 6 million in this country, about 6 million in Israel, about 6 million in the diaspora scattered around the world. And to believe that they control everything and they're the source of all this evil is just so irrational. It's beyond even sort of rational thought. So whether you look at the nation of Israel and the hatred of the Arab countries wanting to push Israel into the sea, when it's so insignificant in terms of land area compared to the land area that they have, or you look at the obsession that people have with the Jewish people, and to say, well, they control everything. Well, yes, there's some Jewish people that work in Hollywood. Yes, there's some Jewish people in Wall Street banks. But to say that is just so irrational, and I think illustrates only so well kind of this anti-Semitic spiritual warfare that we're warned about even in the Old Testament. We'll probably get into that in just a minute with Scott Shay, but let me also mention that one of the pieces I did not get to is also the third article we've posted here. We may get back to it tomorrow. The left goes full open borders, and the documentation for the fact that more and more individuals running for office who are asking for your vote a week from today want to abolish ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office, want to make sure that anybody can come across our border at any time for any reason, is amazing to me, and I think represents a dramatic shift, because if nothing else, you can watch one of the statements by Senator Barack Obama, which I noticed the other day and reposted it on my Twitter feed, that Donald Trump says, I agree with President Obama. In that case, he was, of course, Senator Obama, but it shows the dramatic shift in mindset in just the last couple of years. And since I did mention the name Dennis Prager, his commentary, his PragerU video this week is on that very subject, which he does a very good job of documenting how that policy has changed, at least in terms of the leadership of the Democratic Party. And so I think that may be an issue in this election, which, again, is a week from today. We'll be back right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to this program any length of time, you know that we really want you to develop a biblical worldview and know how to defend a biblical worldview. That second one is oftentimes called apologetics. How do we begin to defend the idea that we believe in God, we believe in the Bible, and other kinds of things? And one of those very significant challenges comes from the so-called new atheists. Matter of fact, last week when I was teaching up in Missouri in a class, I did a whole series on how to respond to some of the challenges of the so-called new atheists, because we have more and more people arguing there is really no evidence for the existence of God. Well, we've in the past given you a chance to hear from Christian authors who have certainly made a very compelling case for the existence of God and for a belief in the Bible. But I thought it would be very helpful for you to hear from a Jewish individual who does the same kind of thing, and especially since in this new book, In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, there's a chapter on why do bad things happen to God's people. This is a question a lot of us have been asking over the last couple of days when we see the greatest massacre of Jewish people in American history, which took place in Pittsburgh. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about the arguments for that and for understanding who God is and how even in the 21st century you can believe in the existence of God and certainly believe in the Bible. And so we bring to the microphone Scott Shay, who has been a very successful person in the business area in Wall Street, private equity, venture capital, banking, and the rest, co-founded Signature Bank in New York. Many of us love to watch TED Talks. He gave a TED Talk a while back that talked about the idea of breaking up some of the big banks and those kinds of things. If you have read some of his other books, perhaps the book that many people would be aware of is the Getting Our Groove Back, How to Energize American Jewelry. And this book really is an attempt to begin to focus on the question of religion and atheism. The book is entitled In Good Faith. We have information about him and the book on our website. So, Scott, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's really a pleasure to be with you, and you have a great show that's got a reputation all over the place, East Coast, and I really love the fact that you grapple with how each individual should take responsibility for understanding the Bible and being able to answer the tough questions. So much respect to you for all your work.
Well, and I've watched you on video, so I certainly am familiar with some of your work as well. And let's, if we can, for just a minute, I know it's only a short chapter in your book, chapter 19, but why do bad things happen to God's people? That's a question a lot of people are asking right now. And it's really sad, even as Dennis Prager in his commentary today says, when you see people murdering Christians in a church. But there is something even more unique about the murder of Jews in a synagogue, because they're really being murdered for being Jews. It's this whole issue of anti-Semitism, which was in the hearts and minds of this individual that went into that synagogue. Give us just a little bit of a sense of how to think this through, because this is one of the arguments that some of our atheist friends say, well, there can't be a God because a God that loved us would not allow an evil man like this to go and do what he actually did over the weekend.
Well, sadly, Kerby, there's a lot of evil in the world, and not believing in God doesn't doesn't either make that more tenable or more understandable, frankly. I'm the child of a Holocaust survivor. My father was born in Spexno, Lithuania, and when he was about 14, his whole Jewish community was taken outside into a town square, into an area, and divided up. And my father was separated from his father, and his father, my grandfather, was put in a group that was murdered before they even left Spexno. And then my father was sent to slave labor, and then subsequently to the concentration camps. He was liberated, thankfully, by the Americans because he was only 60 pounds at that time.
Yes.
And he was probably days away from death. Had he been liberated days later, he wouldn't be alive. I wouldn't be here on this show talking to you.
Yes.
So my father and my family understood that evil can exist in the world. And my father had an interesting relationship with God, in my view, which is that he was very certain that God existed. There was such a small path that would have allowed him to get safely to the United States, safely to Chicago, and marry and have a child, that while so many were murdered, that and one little thing been different in his entire path to Chicago, he wouldn't have made it to Chicago. So he was certain there was a God, but he was angry at God. I mean, he gave God the silent treatment.
Sure. Understandable.
And, so when he, and I've always believed that God understood why he was getting the silent treatment from my father, and respected his right to do so. But that's different. My father saw evil as evil can be, and yet he knew there was a God. So those questions, that question really is a separate question from how does God allow evil to happen? If you believe that there's a God, how can God allow that to happen? And that's a separate question.
And I think it's one we will get into as we talk about the so-called new atheist. And, of course, when we get early on in your book, you quote from people that we talk about on this program with some regularity, whether it's Richard Dawkins and the God Delusion, or Sam Harris and the End of Faith, or Letters to a Christian Nation, or Daniel Dennett and the idea of the breaking the spell, or even Darwin's dangerous ideas, or even a more recent one, and I've started reading some of Steven Pinker's books as well.
Yep.
These are individuals
and Yuval Harari.
Yeah, and
so, Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*, *Homo Deus*, and *21 Lessons*, which are very atheist books.
And these are books that are on the New York Times bestseller list. And so what I say, Scott, is even as I was educating these students last week, I had about 60 students, they're all college graduates, are going to go out. Some are going to go into ministry, some are going to go into business. But I just said, look, your generation is going to have to address this more than any generation, because the rise of the nuns, that would be those people who have no belief. They have kind of none of the above. In other words, they're atheist, agnostic, or no preference. Those are increasing as a percentage in the millennial generation. Matter of fact, tomorrow we do our millennial roundtable. And so you're going to have to know how to answer those questions. And this is why I was so thrilled when your book came across. It's 500 pages. We won't obviously cover all of the issues, but I wanted to educate people about it, introduce them into it, and then, of course, give them a chance to go to some of the websites and material that we have available there. So let's take a break, and when we come back, if you are interested in this book, and I do commend it to you, fascinating book indeed, In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism. We have a link to Amazon where you can get it in hardcover or in Kindle, and that would be a little bit easier on your weight because it's a pretty thick and heavy book to address really important issues. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Scott Shay, and of course, we'll open up your phones to give you a chance to join the conversation if you'd like to do so. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Senator Ben Sasse writes in his new book about the vanishing American adult, our coming-of-age crisis, and how to rebuild a culture of self-reliance. He recently took some material from the book and wrote about what happens when we don't raise kids to become adults. He tells the story of being tapped to become president of Midland University at the age of 37 years old. The board of directors did so because Ben Sasse has the reputation as a turnaround guy who specializes in helping troubled companies become solvent. The university certainly needed his help. They were on the verge of missing payroll 4 months in a row, but he soon discovered that finances might not have been the biggest problem at the school. One student, for example, staged a sit-in at the president's office and announced that he would not leave until the president resolved the scheduling problem for him. He was upset that the registrar wouldn't be offering a particular course he needed the following semester. When Ben Sasse engaged the student in conversation, he proclaimed, "You need to figure this out. I pay tuition to go to this school, which means I pay your salary, so you work for me." The university conducted annual surveys about student experience on campus. It not only showed their lack of a work ethic, but a lack of understanding of the difference between production and consumption. The activities they said they enjoyed most were sleeping in, skipping classes, and partying. A few mentioned canceled classes as the best part of their 4 years. I hope that some of these examples seem crazy to you. Unfortunately, for many in this emerging generation, these attitudes seem just about right. That is why Ben Sasse wants to remind these young people that growing up involves maturity, hard work, and even delayed gratification. If not, we'll have a country of perpetual kids. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Graceworks Pictures, Indivisible, based on the true story of Army Chaplain Darren Turner and his wife Heather. Rated PG-13. Now playing. IndivisibleMovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Scott Shay as we talk about his book, In God Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, broken into 6 sections, one on idolatry, and we'll come back to that early on to talk about. Is the Bible unjust and is progress secular? Is there something about evil? Does science make belief in God irrational? Is the Bible a hoax? And then finally, why have faith and why pray? It's some great material, some very practical material, and some very intellectually rigorous material as well, all in this book. And Scott, let's focus on this first section on idolatry. One of the things I've heard you say in other interviews is you wrote this book because you couldn't find anything like it. And I can find bits and pieces of your book in other books. This one, for example, reminds me of a book by Herb Schlossberg called Idols for Destruction. But this idea of idolatry, you know as well as I do that when we talk about idolatry, a lot of people's eyes, whether they're Jewish or Christian, kind of their eyes just roll back and they say, well, that's Old Testament stuff. No, it isn't, is it? Explain.
No, we somehow thought that we licked idolatry 3,800 years ago with the god King Pharaoh. But the reality is the whole 20th century was a catalog of idolatry. You had Stalin, who sent tens of millions of the people to the Gulag and starved a quarter of the Ukraine. You had Mao, who marched 30 million people to their death. You had Pol Pot, who killed a quarter of his population, murdered a quarter of his population. Of course, Hitler. Why did these people get away with it? Because they became idols. You know, Stalin had military pageants, built temples to himself, as did clearly Hitler, as did Mao. Stalin actually flashed had the Soviet Space Agency flash a a light model of himself into space. They took on being idols because why else would 30 million people march to their death? Why else would people take orders? Just the same way people took orders in ancient Egypt to throw the Israelite babies into the Nile, so people took orders to kill all the kulaks in the Soviet Union and to send tens of millions into the gulag. So what is idolatry? Idolatry is what the Hebrew Scriptures came to overturn. It's the most fundamental, revolutionary idea that came to humanity up until the Bible, which is that idolatry is a set of lies about power. It's ascribing super authority or super powers to finite beings. In other words, people, individuals who, whether or not they are corrupt, are corruptible, ideologies or elements. And so no matter what you call these things, whether they're called ideologies or the like, when you make them into idols, when you ascribe to them super authority, and you're willing to follow them blindly in bad faith, as I describe in my book in a lot more detail what bad faith is, then horrors can happen. And up to the time of the Bible, it was natural for these horrors to happen. It would have been inexplicable that you wouldn't murder and rampage someone who believed in a different God king, and was because they weren't part of you. There was no shared divine spark of godliness as we as Bible believers believe. And no.
Well, and again, when you have that kind of idolatry, that kind of paganism, that you reject the idea that people are created in the image of God, that they have value and dignity and all of the rest that goes with that, then people become expendable. And so it's striking that in the fourth chapter that you talk about this idea, and I've run into this before because I've done debates with atheists, that they'll say, well, I can be good without God. I agree. Some of the nicest people I've ever met are atheists that I've interacted with. But the point is, you don't have a basis for it if you believe that human beings are nothing more than just biology. They're maybe more evolved animals, but there's no spiritual aspect. There's no divine justice. There's no God. Then, yes, they become expendable, and that's exactly what we saw in the horrors of the 20th century. Whether you just look at Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, we could add a lot more to that list, you come up with more than 100 million deaths just from individuals like that alone, don't you?
Absolutely. So I think you're making a critical point. The way I discern between the two kinds of atheists, because there are atheists who are good people, who frankly I think are entirely moral people. And then there are atheists who scare the living daylights out of me. And the difference is that the moral atheists are those who ascribe in one way or another to the core of the Bible's message, whether they call it that or not, which is the golden rule. As Hillel stated it, don't do what is hateful unto others. Don't do unto others what is hateful unto you, what you wouldn't want done unto you. As he said, the rest of the Bible is commentary. Go learn it. And that's the core again and again of the Bible, is really coming down to the way we treat others, to our responsibility to others, to our shared godliness. Now, an atheist who subscribes to the golden rule and doesn't want to cause harm doesn't want to do to others as he wouldn't want done unto himself, is essentially saying that we have a shared spark of humanity. It may not be godliness, but at least it's humanity, and that's what gives them the morals. By contrast, what the folks that I call Machiavellian atheists, people, and I describe a fellow I met early in my career,
yes,
who was only interested in what was good for him. He was a trader, a markets trader, and what was important to him was only what was important to him. Nobody else really mattered. And so if some shoddy mortgages went into a securitization, that was okay because other people didn't matter. All that mattered was him not getting caught, him being able to amass more money. And so he viewed himself essentially as an idol, and everybody else was expendable. Now, he wasn't going to go out and take a gun and shoot people. I don't want to say that by any measure. But he didn't really care what happened to other people. There was no fundamental moral underpinning. And those are the kind of atheists that scare me a lot, because those that have power to do bad things, to do really bad things, can do really bad things. And we've unfortunately witnessed it and continue to witness it frequently.
Yes. One of the other sections that I'd like to kind of move, and again, we'll have to move through quickly since I want to cover some, is part 2 is the Bible unjust and is progress secular? And I think you're borrowing this idea that I see in Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, in which he's sort of arguing the reason we have progress is due to the Enlightenment. I would argue that the reason we have progress is because of everything from the Reformation, the Renaissance, and all the rest. I mean, even when you start talking about progress in politics, well, they point to people like Locke. You mean the person that quotes from the Bible? When they point to some of the other reformers, it seems to me right now that the argument is that you're not a Bible believer. We have progress because we have a secular mindset. But if I look back and look at the great institutions of Western civilization, a lot of those came out of biblical ideas, didn't they?
Yes. So look, I think we can both agree with Steven Pinker that the arc of progress has been positive, and that
Sure.
the world is as Dr. Martin Luther King and others have said, the arc of justice is long, but ultimately. The arc of the universe is long, but ultimately it tends toward justice, because I believe that that's the way that God is shepherding us in some way or another. But I think you and I would agree that man is endowed with reason to tell the difference between lies and not lies,
right?
Between truth and not truth, between justice and not justice. And Steven Pinker would say that we've just sort of evolved that way. That that scientific reasoning led us there. Now, I certainly don't believe that scientific reasoning leads us to morality. I think science is useful. I love science, but that doesn't mean. But science isn't moral in any sense. Science is a tool, and so I fundamentally disagree with a lot of what Steven Pinker says, including he thinks that much of religion, other than some institutions, have actually been negative toward morality, and I certainly disagree with him strongly there.
Well, let me jump in, and then when we come back, we have one of those mandatory breaks. So let me get in there real quickly, and we'll come back and get back to that issue of whether religion is evil, whether religion is irrational, and those are some other key points in the book. But we have one of those mandatory breaks. And again, Scott Shay with us. If you just joined us, talking about the book In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism. Of course, we also talked a little bit about how to apply some of that to the massacre there of Jews in Pittsburgh, the greatest massacre of Jews in American history. We'll talk more about that and this right after these important messages.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. pointofview.net/team. pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife Jenny was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. Medishare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
Medishare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without Medishare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Scott Shay. He is the author of the book In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and listen, maybe take some notes, get a copy of the book. We have a link there. You can get it both in hardback as well as in Kindle. And Scott, we were sort of heading into that direction, so let's go there. And that is, a lot of our atheist friends, the so-called new atheists, are saying, well, religion is evil. And they came to that conclusion because of 9/11. They saw the evil there. But first of all, I think it's fair to say that oftentimes they paint with a really broad brush, just because, for example, the Taliban had all sorts of evil, or the ISIS crusade in one way or another killed so many people, should not be an indictment over all Muslims. We will be certainly the first to admit that sometimes religion has been a justification or a reason for some religious wars, but to say that religion is evil and something that needs to be eradicated like slavery, which is, again, one of the comments from our so-called new atheist friends, is over the top, isn't it?
Yes, and you're getting to really the key point that none of the new atheists understand, which is they conflate monotheism with idolatry, and they also don't recognize, which I think we as believers need to recognize and need to actually take even more responsibility for, is that there are plenty of idolaters who cloak themselves in monotheistic garb. And when I talked about idolatry, remember, it was a set of lies about power. It was, usurping a power. Well, the way we Jews count the commandments, the third commandment, and I think the way Christians count it is the second commandment, is you shall not take God's name in vain. It says, Lo tisa et shem Adonai Elokecha l'shav ki lo yinakeh Adonai et ashrei yaseh et shmo l'shav. Okay, the reason I'm saying the Hebrew there is because what that means is not taking God's name in vain, not, putting the word damn next to the divine name or something like that. It means taking God's name and usurping that name. So if I set myself up as sole spokesperson for God, and say, like certain people did in the Taliban and the like, and people who are blind, and say, I have a direct line to God. I will tell you what to do. You don't need to read scriptures. You don't need to look at your text. You just follow what I say. Well, that is indistinguishable from idolatry. That's why the Hebrew scriptures are pretty clear that we have to be on the lookout for false prophets, because they can lead people astray. And if you look at it, the way, again, we count it as the third commandment, I'm not exactly sure where you end up in the second commandment, but the way we count this, that's the only commandment that it says God will not absolve you for. In other words, you can break the first commandment, you can be an atheist, you can become a believer, you can steal, but you can repent, you can lie, but you can fess up and repent. You can be forgiven for just about anything. But when you take God's name in vain, the third commandment, well, that's again when the horrors can really start, because then monotheists park their reason at the door and say, well, this person is telling me what God wants. And that's extremely dangerous. And to a certain degree, the atheists they're sort of, blasting in a wide direction. But on that point, it's a bullseye. And we as religious people have to call out, in the name of God, those who usurp his name. And then I think this world will be a better place.
Well, another aspect of that, and let's just say the obvious, is that there have been times when the church has persecuted Jewish individuals. Now, again, when I talk about that, I mean church in the false sense of that word. Many people maybe aren't even possessing any kind of faith. They were just professing it and used it as power. But we have seen in the case of how the Jewish people have been treated, even in Western cultures sometimes, by those individuals who were, again, those fakers, those monotheistic idolaters. True?
Absolutely true. And sadly, I mean, I think that many churches have repented of what was done. I mean, in the Crusades, at one point, the Jews of Europe so many were murdered that there may have been only tens of thousands of families of Ashkenazi Jews in all of Europe, because rather than march to the Holy Land, they marched first to dispossess the Jews and to murder the Jews. And we see that, unfortunately, we've seen that, and that's a form of idolatry. And look, what happened in Pittsburgh is a form of someone who believed that he possessed the truth and could enforce the truth. And that's certainly a form of evil. It's certainly a form of idolatry.
What about this idea of evil? Because the whole section of your book is there's something about evil. And we recognize, even when we talk about this issue, and of course you get into that also in the second section, when you talk about slavery, racism, the mistreatment of women, and on, we have to recognize that, yes, there are bad people in the world, make moral choices, but at the same time, our atheists sometimes want to say either religion is useless or God is evil. It's a false dichotomy, don't you think?
Right. That's the title of one of my chapters, and That's certainly a false dichotomy. I mean, here's the thing. I think that the less people read the Bible and know the Bible, the less they like it. I mean, the atheists say that. I think this is almost a quote from Richard Dawkins, is that the Old Testament is the most misogynistic, homophobic, sexist, racist, xenophobic, pro-slavery, pro-rape text that certainly we don't get our values from. Now, what I do in the second section of my book, in part 2 of my book, is to dissect each and every one of those claims.
Right.
And the Bible, by the way, is one of the first documents in the entire history of the world to give women agency. I mean, we'd be nowhere without when you even look at the patriarchs. I mean, Rebecca plays a critical role in the patriarchs. We'd be nowhere in the Exodus story without Yocheved, without Miriam, without the daughter of Pharaoh, without the Hebrew midwives, and of course without Zipporah. Each of those people saved Moses' life before he even gets going. We'd be nowhere, and all of those people take their own actions. The Hebrew midwives, the 2 women, are the first examples of civil disobedience in the history of the world. They actually say no to Pharaoh at the risk of their life in an instant. So what I do is I take, and we'd have to extend the show until sometime around tomorrow 10 a.m. to do this entirely right now, but what I do in the second section is to take each of those accusations against the Hebrew Scriptures and to show why a close reading is really quite the opposite. And I commend your readers to do that. I commend your listeners to do that. I would only say this, that my job is even a little harder than it might be for you. Because my job, there's a great book that Paul Copan wrote, Is God a Moral Monster?
Right.
Understanding the Old Testament.
And we've had him on a number of times, by the way. Yes.
Great book. I like him a lot in terms of reading. I've never had the opportunity of meeting the gentleman, but, and I closely scrutinize his book, but I have to show that every one of those accusations isn't correct without resort to the Christian Scriptures.
Right.
So,
which is tough because you have the Yahweh wars and things like that. Yes.
If he gets to a difficult point, he can always, at a certain point in his book, say, well, this is solved by the Christian Scriptures. As someone arguing for the base text, I think, of all monotheism. And by the way, I'm joined in my book. I interviewed a number of Christian faith leaders and even two Muslim faith leaders as well, because I wanted to make this book about monotheism, not about Judaism. So I don't interview any rabbis at all. But I consider myself a lot more expert in the Hebrew Scriptures than certainly in either the New Testament or the Quran. That's for sure.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. And we have one other issue, at least, to put on the table: whether the Bible is evil. Then, of course, the question is the Bible of course, in particular, a belief in God irrational. So we'll talk about that. He did mention Paul Copan. He's been on the program with us before, serves with me with the International Society of Christian Apologetics. And that book, Is God a Moral Monster? When God goes to Starbucks, did God really command genocide? Or a couple that get us into the whole issue of the so-called Yahweh wars. How about the Canaanites and the Philistines and those kinds of issues? So, and again, this is well covered from a Jewish perspective by Scott Shay. But Scott, when we come back, let's talk about this issue. We have, again, one of those mandatory breaks. We'll come back and talk about, is this belief in God irrational? That is certainly the argument of Richard Dawkins and the so-called new atheist. It is the argument being made by so many in our culture. You have a very good answer. We'll hear that right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. America was saddened to learn of the loss of Billy Graham. Some have openly wondered whether history will ever witness another one like him. The better question to ask at this point in our history may be, can there be another Billy Graham? Graham's crusades were public expressions of faith, many times taking place on public property. In 1952, Graham's crusade visited Washington, D.C. Graham held services on the very steps of the United States Capitol, enlisting supportive government officials to secure the permission needed for such an event. He would go on to preach at dozens of the country's most historic and publicly owned venues, including what is today known as Camping World Stadium. In 2015, the football teams from two Christian schools in Florida faced off in that same stadium where, in 1969 and again in 1983, Billy Graham stood to share his gospel message with thousands in attendance. Incredibly, these two religious schools were denied use of the city-owned microphone to pray over the same loudspeaker once used to amplify the disarming baritone voice of Billy Graham as he preached and prayed. If the First Amendment does not protect the right of two Christian schools to pray for 30 seconds over a city-owned loudspeaker in 2015, can it protect the next Billy Graham who wants to use the same public address system in the same stadium? To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
So many good principles in the book, in God, certainly in good faith, and certainly it relates to the whole idea of a belief in God, questioning religion and atheism. And we've covered a number, but again, there are so many other issues that you may want to read about in the book. But I thought, Scott, for just a minute, we might focus on this idea of faith and belief in God is irrational. That is certainly the premise of kind of the manifesto by Richard Dawkins. But even Sam Harris says, religion gives people an excuse to not believe rational things. And yet, I think that is not true of Jewish scholars. It's certainly not true of Christian theologians and Christian apologists. And so this is one of the reasons why, again, you address that whole question as to whether or not a belief in God is irrational. How do we think our way through that?
Well, I think that's a great question, and it's a question that I've talked to a lot of folks about as I've begun this book tour. So it's even the reason I titled my book the way I did, In Good Faith, because there's a difference between good faith and bad faith. What is good faith? Good faith is evidence-based faith. For example, I'll give you what I do every day is we make loans, which are called, sometimes full faith and credit here at the bank. And we make a loan based on the evidence, based on the character, based on the numbers. I can't tell you for sure that a loan will pay off, but I can come up with an evidence-based way of reasoning to me that the borrower is a good person, the numbers work, the business is stable, etc. The same thing about faith is that my belief in God comes from the fact that I believe that there is evidence that's consistent. I believe that it's plausible that the Bible was written by God. I don't have to prove it. And so I believe in God and a God that makes sense, not a God that's part of nature, but a God that created nature. And everything about science, everything about technology, everything about our modern morality is consistent with an omnipotent, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God. Now, that's very different than bad faith, which is how the atheists use a little bit of sleight of hand here. Because what they define is a God in nature. They can do studies, intercessory prayer studies, scientific studies, and they can define God. They can define this infinite being. They talk about, and a lot of the new atheists talk about different groups such as talk about Hitler and talk about Nazism. Nazism was idolatry. There's so many idolatries in the world, and they conflate the god King Pharaoh and idolatry with monotheism. Well, that's bad faith, and that's what I was trying to explain before. Idolatry can lead to horrors, and frequently does. And that's the faith that that atheists criticize, because they don't get the difference between monotheism, between good faith and bad faith. I believe that the Bible, that it's rational to believe in God with all we know about science and historicity of the Bible and our modern morality. And the atheists, just don't get or don't want to get that, frankly.
Well, and again, that is a key issue because there is a belief in God not in spite of the evidence, but because of it. One of the books that oftentimes we talk about around the table here is a book that says, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And in your whole section there, you talk about how whether you look at science, history, archaeology, whatever you might look at, but if you even just use rationality, we are believing in God because there is evidence for it, rather than in spite of it. And yet our atheist friends oftentimes say, well, if you guys didn't teach this religion stuff, the default factor, the default value would be atheism. Everybody be an atheist if you didn't teach this religion. If I could just get rid of all religion, nobody would believe in God. But I don't think so. As I've said before, we got about 2 billion people that call themselves Christians, 1.5 billion people that call themselves Muslims, 18 million Jewish people, another billion people that are either Hindu or Buddhist, probably another billion that are animist. We are a very religious people on this planet. And so in some respects, we are so not because we are denying the evidence, but because the evidence around us seems to point to the existence of a supreme being. Wouldn't you think?
I do. And I worry about people who think that it's okay to not believe in God. I mean, Kurt Gödel said it very well. He said, when people stop believing in God, they'll believe in anything.
Yes.
And we've learned that time and again. That's what I was talking about in the 20th century. I mean, the primary causes of more than 100 million deaths and murders in the 20th century was because people was through regimes in which God was denied. And so there was nobody to step up and say, stop. There was nobody to step up and create a revolution. I mean, that's how the revolution in Poland and a lot of Eastern Europe happened. It's because of a deep religious impulse. The reason in my view, the impetus for anti-slavery movement here in the United States was clearly a religious impulse.
Right.
And the first feminists were deeply Christian women.
Yeah. Whether you look at the abolition movement, the temperance movement, the suffrage movement, I mean, just go on and on and on. Certainly religion has had a very positive impact, even if our new atheist friends wouldn't believe it. Let me just mention that the book is 500 pages. It's published by Post Hill Press, but we have a link so that if you would like to get a copy, no doubt you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it available to you to get there. It's also available in Kindle. And I know you're in the midst of a speaking tour, and I appreciate, if nothing else, that you were willing to give us an hour today. I know somebody who is indeed the founder and chairman of Signature Bank in New York has better things to do than spend time talking about this, but I, in some respects, think this is the most significant contribution you've made today. So thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. This is really, I feel like, the most important thing I'm doing, and I just would add the audiobook is coming out sometime late next week, so you can even listen to the book.
Okay, well, then we'll put that link up there as well. I imagine you'll probably find it on Amazon as well. Again, it's available in hardback. It's available in Kindle, and if you wanted to begin to understand how to respond to many of the accusations that come from the so-called new atheist and really make the case for your belief in God, this one, from a Jewish perspective, just very well done. And Scott, I appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View.
All good things to you. Many blessings.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to have our good friend Jerry Newcombe on, his new book, American Amnesia. But just before we do that, I wanted to mention that if you go to our website right now, pointofview.net, you'll see that we have created another possible link there for viewing election resources. Now, I recognize some of you have already voted, but if not, a week from today is the election, and if you said, I'd like to vote early, the material is there. Of course, also, I might also mention that if you want to vote on Election Day, that material is there. Now, there is some new material that is available, but if you click through that, you will see a map of the United States. Then you click on your state, and that will then help you, once you put in your zip code, know a little bit more about some of these individuals. Of course, it will already post the federal candidates and the state candidates, but if you want to work your way down and get more information that is from our good friends at iVoter, that is there as well. We've included some other resources, so click around because you'll find that there are other voter guides listed. In particular, let me mention those on the right-hand side. Focus on the Family over the years has had these various family policy groups, and so we have the state voter guide for each one of those places where indeed there is a state that has a family policy group, and that is a very long list, as you will see, so we give you that link as well. So once I've said this once, I will say it again. Each day we add something else. So even if you've been there, go back again. You might find something else that we've added, and all of it so that you will be able to cast an intelligent vote either this week or next Tuesday. We'll be back with more right after this.
From Graceworks Pictures comes Indivisible, based on the true story of Army Chaplain Darren Turner and his wife Heather.
It is with great honor that I have served my country. But I only stand before you today because Jesus is my rock, and because I have a family who loves and believes in me.
One marriage, one family, under God. Indivisible. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at indivisiblemovie.com.
A major problem with socialism is that it allows people to benefit from the hard work of others. It permits the idle and indifferent to live off the efforts of their neighbors. For a society to prosper, everyone who is able has to contribute. And that's the only way Point of View Radio can bring you truth. We are profoundly thankful for you who have joined the Truth Team and make this program possible. If you're not on board, join today. Invest in our future together. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Great opportunity this hour to talk with our good friend Jerry Newcombe, and we're going to be looking at all sorts of histories, issues from history, as well as some of the contemporary debates that are taking place in our world right now. New book is really a collection of his essays called Amnesia, and it deals with remembering our nation's Judeo-Christian roots, also renewing our role as active citizens, and then also recovering our religious liberty in the face of militant secularism. And these collection of essays are endorsed by Bill Federer and by myself, David Gibbs, as well as people like Star Parker, Joseph Farah, Frank Wright, as well as Peter Lillebeck. And, of course, he co-authored a book with him, Washington's Sacred Fire. Has been on, of course, Fox News Channel, been on with Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher, the Hev 700 Club, Jim Dobson's Family Talk, as well as been on this program as well. Serves as the senior producer and on-air television host and columnist for D. James Kennedy Ministries. Also has a weekly radio program, Vocal Point, on GraceNet Radio and other venues as well. A graduate of Tulane University, Wheaton Graduate School, with a doctorate of ministry from Knox Theological Seminary. And Jerry, it is always great to have you on the program with us.
Thank you, Kerby, and thank you so much for so graciously endorsing the book. I appreciate it.
Again, there are just a whole series of over 100 different columns that you have written in the past, but I thought I might start off with the title for just a minute, and that is American Amnesia. We do a millennial roundtable, and we will do that again tomorrow with Nick Pitts. And one of the things we pointed out recently, and I pointed it out in a column, is that a study done recently with the Woodrow Wilson Foundation found that less than 1 in 5 of young people under the age of 45 could actually pass the citizenship test of America. Which means, and I can hear you gasp, Jerry, this means that a person who is a naturalized citizen probably knows more about our history and our government than somebody who was born here. Now, American Amnesia assumes that you knew it and forgot it. There's a whole generation of young people that didn't know it in the first place, and that's one of the reasons you write those columns, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I am speaking collectively when I say it. It's along the lines of what President Lincoln said during the Civil War, how he gave a beautiful prayer proclamation in March of 1863 asking for the nation to pray and setting aside a date in April for that prayer. And he said that we've been blessed like no other nation in history before, intoxicated with unbroken success. You know, we've experienced one victory after another, but we, you know, as a nation, but we have forgotten God. And so it's along those lines that I'm talking about American amnesia, that we as a nation have forgotten God. You remember the old story about Solzhenitsyn, when Solzhenitsyn, the most incredible writer of the whole debacle and the whole massacre, the whole phenomenon that was the Soviet Union for years. It dominated the world and frightened people. It was the main boogeyman, if you will, but more than just a boogeyman, the villain in the whole Cold War, the communist control by the Soviet Union. And here they had killed tens of millions of people, and Solzhenitsyn, who wrote many books about it, he even spent 10 years in Stalin's gulags and so forth for having written a letter to a friend, and he had some sort of oblique reference to Stalin in a negative light. And for that, he was sentenced to hard labor in Siberia.
Wow.
And anyway, bottom line is, Solzhenitsyn said, in all of my study of the Soviet Union and the terrible things that happened, I remember when some peasants were arguing, and they said, we have forgotten God. That's why all these terrible things have happened to us. We have forgotten God. And Solzhenitsyn said, in all of my studies, I've never found a better explanation, even though that's very simplistic, than that peasant's statement. We have forgotten God. That's why all these things have happened to us. And, of course, that's on a higher, much worse level, of course, than America. In other words, we are not in any way near that kind of level of going down that road of what the Soviet Union became and so forth. But we are on the road, and that's not good, especially in a nation which our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, says our rights come from the Creator, and those God-given rights are non-negotiable.
Well, again, if we're on that road, I want to get a GPS to get us on the right road, and that's why we're talking about your book today. Again, American Amnesia. First of all, we have a link so that you can perhaps get it. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but I know sometimes people say I'm a little frustrated there, and the book is 350-plus pages, 115 different commentaries. And I want to focus on that idea of remembering our nation's Judeo-Christian roots. But let me jump down to one of the columns you wrote, Who is Rewriting Our History? If you just hear the conversation we've just had about the fact that we've forgotten God, there's a whole generation that never learned about God or learned about the Pilgrims, learned about the Constitution, learned about the founders, the framers, and others, or even the structure of our government. And so in some respects, that's because we are not teaching these ideas in the school. What's going on there?
Oh, that's absolutely true. I think since the 60s, it would be safe to say there has been a systematic removal of so much of our Christian heritage. But it did begin actually before the 60s. I would say more like the 30s with John Dewey, the father, if you will, of modern education. There was a systematic change in which they tried to basically downplay and cut us off from our Christian roots. And so today, the average student in America, instead of being, getting some idea of the privilege it is to be an American, so often the messages that are portrayed are just real negative, and we see this not only in school, but we see this even in museums. Kerby, I went to one of the Smithsonian branches in Washington, D.C. about 3 months ago. I wrote about it. It's in the book. And I was just shocked to see how they not only downplay our history, they highlight all the negative stuff.
Yes.
Well, the negative stuff is there, and it's terrible stuff. And thankfully, we are moving towards making lots of corrections towards the negative stuff. I haven't seen any slaves, out in the marketplace and so forth. And thank God for that. Thank God for those 600,000 men who died in the Civil War. And obviously, one of the big key outcomes of the Civil War was that there would be no more legal slavery in America. Thank God for that. But in the meantime, when they highlight only the negative and they don't show the positive, they don't show, for example, how the Founding Fathers laid it all on the line. They said, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor for the sake of this Declaration of Independence, again, our birth certificate. When we ignore those positive things, when we ignore the Christian roots, all those Christians who founded all these different key colonies and basically paved the way to representative government, people don't understand why in the world is that caravan wanting to come to the United States of America and not go back to Honduras.
Well, we're going to take a break and get into that conversation with Jerry Newcombe right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Senator Ben Sasse writes in his new book about the vanishing American adult, our coming-of-age crisis, and how to rebuild a culture of self-reliance. He recently took some material from the book and wrote about what happens when we don't raise kids to become adults. He tells the story of being tapped to become president of Midland University at the age of 37 years old. The board of directors did so because Ben Sasse has the reputation as a turnaround guy who specializes in helping troubled companies become solvent. The university certainly needed his help. They were on the verge of missing payroll 4 months in a row, but he soon discovered that finances might not have been the biggest problem at the school. One student, for example, staged a sit-in at the president's office and announced that he would not leave until the president resolved the scheduling problem for him. He was upset that the registrar wouldn't be offering a particular course he needed the following semester. When Ben Sasse engaged the student in conversation, he proclaimed, "You need to figure this out. I pay tuition to go to this school, which means I pay your salary, so you work for me." The university conducted annual surveys about student experience on campus. It not only showed their lack of a work ethic, but a lack of understanding of the difference between production and consumption. The activities they said they enjoyed most were sleeping in, skipping classes, and partying. A few mentioned canceled classes as the best part of their 4 years. I hope that some of these examples seem crazy to you. Unfortunately, for many in this emerging generation, these attitudes seem just about right. That is why Ben Sasse wants to remind these young people that growing up involves maturity, hard work, and even delayed gratification. If not, we'll have a country of perpetual kids. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Graceworks Pictures, Indivisible, based on the true story of Army Chaplain Darren Turner and his wife Heather. Rated PG-13. Now playing. IndivisibleMovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today columnist and producer Jerry Newcombe, also talk show host, and his book is entitled American Amnesia. Is America paying the price for forgetting God, the source of our liberty? Jerry Newcombe with us. And again, if you would like to know more about him, we have a website that we have a link to. If you'd like to know more about the book and to order it, we certainly have made it available to you as well. And Jerry, you talked about the caravan. Now I guess there's 3 caravans coming to this country. And yet it's interesting because those people that oftentimes support this idea of let's bring people into this country often are very critical of that. And chapter 12 or part 12 or the 12th column, whatever you want to say, of yours is why do so many Americans hate America? So whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's the people funded by George Soros, whether it's the so-called resistance, whether it is the swamp, whether it is university professors that teach about what an evil country this is, or the Smithsonian particular demonstration, there are so many people today that hate America. And so the question I want to ask is, if America is such an awful place, why is it that so many people around the world are trying to get here as the land of opportunity?
You're absolutely right. And not only get here, in some cases they're willing to risk their lives to do so. You know, Kerby, you're talking to me, you're in Texas, and I'm in South Florida. And one time, about 20 years ago, I was taking a walk on the beach, and I came across a Cuban raft. And I realized, oh, my goodness, what is this thing? It turned out it was basically 3 wooden doors. It's as if under the cover of darkness, these people had torn off doors, 3 doors, and then they put some sort of flotsam or styrofoam or something on the bottom so it would float, and then they had shutters in between that they could sit on, and they nailed all this together. And there were lots of clothing items and a bag that said Havana, and it was really an amazing thing. And I thought, wow, the place at the beach was about 300 miles away from Cuba, although there's other parts of Florida that are much closer. And I thought, man, this is amazing. People risk their lives to try and get over here through shark-infested waters. That would have been a couple of days and nights. I don't know if they had enough food. I don't even know what happened to them as they came, to the States. Chances are they would have been collected and then brought to a place in Homestead where they have some sort of center or whatever to deal with people like this. But I thought, can you imagine risking everything you have in order to make it to here in America, so that maybe, just maybe, you could experience what you and I, Kerby, take for granted every single day, to live here in America and maybe, experience the American dream. I mean, look at you, buddy. You went to Yale grad school and earned, a degree related to the study of science. And here you're working on the cutting edge of apologetics, and you're working in Christian radio, and you're out giving talks, leading people to the Lord and writing books. And, I'm excited about my life, and now I have 3 grandchildren. I'm even that more excited. And so I'll show you pictures anytime you want to see them. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, and it's like, these people, if they could only spend, a day. In fact, there was an article I think I saw a couple weeks ago where it said something like the head of Home Depot wants to take these young people who are out there espousing, then we need socialism in America. He said, if only I could take you to Venezuela and just visit it for a few hours, you would realize how wrong you are about socialism and how much we should be grateful for what we have in America. Not that it's perfect or anything, but may God, use us to make it better so that we can, mend. May God mend thine every flaw, thy liberty under law, as the old hymn says. But it's very exciting to me. And frankly, when you look at the big picture of the American story, you see that Christianity had a big part in the positive aspects of the freedom that we enjoy and the prosperity that we've enjoyed as a result.
Well, again, one of the things that you talk about in the first section is kind of remembering our nation's Judeo-Christian roots, but you sort of alluded to the fact that we are in the midst of an election right now, and a week from today, people are voting, although I suspect a lot of our people have already voted. And so your middle section here deals with renewing our role as active citizens. You have one of your columns was on 10 reasons why the church should not abandon politics, how values voters made the difference in the last midterm elections. Even one of them, does one vote count? What would you say about this? We're in the midst of a campaign season. A lot of people may be a little bit discouraged, but also I sense that there are a lot of people fairly motivated because at least where I live, there seem to be almost record number of people showing up for the midterm elections because I suspect they think these are really going to be important.
Yeah, you're right, Kerby. I mean, I think it's extremely important, and I think it's important to mobilize your audience in particular. In other words, the people who believe in biblical values, to realize that every single one of them, every single one, your vote counts, and your vote is needed. And even if you think it's hopeless or something, don't be that way. Just get out there and vote. If Christians showed up and voted their biblical values, we could sway virtually every single election. And we have to win, by the way, by a little bit of a comfortable margin, because there are people around that don't share our values. They don't realize that they're going to give an account of their lives one day before God. They've bought the lie of somebody like Saul Alinsky, who died in 1972, but he was basically a Machiavellian Marxist community organizer from Chicago. He wrote his classic book called Rules for Radicals, which he dedicated to Lucifer. And he basically said, you need to just seize power and do whatever it takes to get power. The ends justify the means as long as the ends are worthy means. And we see, frankly, Saul Alinsky ideas, played out in on the streets of America. We see it in the riots in the streets. Well, that's not the American way. Goebbels, who was Hitler's propaganda minister, he once said, "History is made in the streets." That statement is really frightening to me because I see people, in a sense, trying to put that into practice. That's not the American way, and that's not the Christian way. And the Alinsky way is not the American way, and it's not the Christian way. But we saw what happened to Brett Kavanaugh. Regardless of your views on Brett Kavanaugh as a jurist, and it seems to me that as an originalist, that's the kind of judge we want to have on the Supreme Court. But regardless of your politics, is it right to tell lies about the guy and smear his reputation because you don't agree with his judicial philosophy? I mean, that's awful. It's not American and it's not Christian.
Well, again, one of the things I was going to talk to you about is that one of your columns there, number 84, you wrote this 2 years ago called The Coming Battle Over the Supreme Court, and you were having a little bit of fear and trepidation about the Neil Gorsuch hearings. But did you ever anticipate the kind of circus that the Brett Kavanaugh hearings developed into?
Well, to some degree, no, and on the other hand, yes. And the reason why is because of I have been studying in the last half year Saul Alinsky. I read his book word for word, The Rules for Radicals. It's so eye-opening, but it just makes you realize what we're up against. But you know what, Kerby? Greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. God has not called us to fear. He has called us to be faithful. All that said, Christians need to wake up and mobilize and be a part of the solution and not part of the problem. For too long, we've abandoned the political process. There's an anecdote I told in the story, if I could say it real fast. When William Wilberforce became a born-again Christian after, while serving maybe 5 years or so in the Parliament, he was elected as a very young man, very privileged background and so forth. So here he is in Parliament. He gets born again. He goes to see a minister, John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, that hymn, and who used to be a slave trade guy. He said, Pastor, now that I'm a Christian, I want to serve the Lord full time. I'm thinking maybe I should, resign Parliament and go and become a minister. What are your thoughts? And John Newton said, I believe, brother, that God could use you where you are. And William Wilberforce took that to heart and became, I think, the greatest Christian statesman in the history of politics, within Christendom. In other words, politics in the last 2,000 years. Wilberforce was such a great, fantastic Christian. He not only fought against the slave trade. That took him about 25 years. Then he fought against slavery in the British Empire. That took him another 25 years. And in the meantime, he also fought for an improvement in morality through the Parliament. And so God bless that advice from Newton. I'm glad he didn't say, oh, yeah, go ahead and just join the ministry and leave the politics for the bad guys.
We'll be back right after this.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife, Jenny, was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. Medishare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
Medishare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without Medishare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. Let's give you a chance to join our conversation today. Jerry Newcombe with us. And if you'd like to join us, that number is now open, 1-800-351-1212. The lines are open for your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We've talked about the importance of remembering our nation's Judeo-Christian roots, which is the first section of his book. Actually, almost half of the columns relate to that. We've been talking about renewing our role as active citizens. We'll get to some other issues in just a minute, but love to hear your comments already about some of the things we've put on the table. Do you think we need to do a better job of teaching about America's history in our public schools and even in our Christian schools, which sometimes don't do as good a job as I think they might on that issue? What about the importance of this election? We're in the midst of a midterm election. What have you noticed? We have noticed a higher turnout than normal. What happens if those people that have Judeo-Christian values go to the polls and vote? Will that make a difference? So again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Also, as we have mentioned before, but let me mention again, we have all sorts of election resources on our website, pointofview.net. It says 2008 midterm election. Click on the button that says View Election Resources. You will immediately then see a map of the United States. You click on your state, and it will then immediately give you information from a voter. And then, of course, you can then put in your zip code so that it will give you not only your statewide and congressional elections, but a variety of others that are a little deeper. We also, on the right-hand side there, have the iVoter Guide. We have the voter guides for the various focus on the family policy groups around the country. We have some material about engaging and equipping your church to vote wisely, and also questions about voter registration deadlines, which for most of you in the listening audience have passed, but not all. And so all of it is available at the website pointofview.net. And so if you would like to join our conversation today, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And we want to give some of you a chance to join our conversation. But Jerry, before I take that first phone call, let's again maybe talk about how important this election is. You know, you hear from time to time, this is the most important election. Well, in addition to the presidential election, midterm elections are very important. And this one, I think, determines whether or not some of the changes that have been implemented by the Trump administration continue or whether they actually cease to move forward. Don't you think?
I think absolutely. I think that the next 2 years would just get totally bogged down with the kind of stuff that we've seen, with all the people like Maxine Waters, yelling, get in their face, scream at them, and all this kind of stuff. The politics of incivility. I mean, even Hillary Clinton said a couple weeks ago that she basically blamed the lack of civility on the part of the of the conservatives, and it doesn't seem to me like that. But anyway, I think that the economy and we who enjoy what Nancy Pelosi called the crumbs, the tax cuts that have been helpful to the middle class, not just the wealthy who are the ones who provide the services that become jobs and so forth. They already have what they need. When you have more socialistic-oriented policies where the government grows to be so big, which is what happened, frankly, under President Obama, then it hurts the John Q. Public. It hurts the little guy who's just trying to make a living, and now you see all these people wanting to come to America, and your heart bleeds for them with the caravan and so forth. But it's like, wow, how does this work? Okay, it takes two jobs to provide food for your family. You better get a third job now, to provide food for other people, in this kind of scenario. So anyway, I think that the choice, in some ways, Kerby, I think indirectly at least, socialism versus free enterprise is on the ballot, in at least indirectly. Because, for example, when the Democrats are promising Medicare for all. Well, there's no real way to pay for that. In fact, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was saying Medicare for all, and then even Jake Tapper on CNN, which is not the most conservative news outlet, of course, he was saying, okay, wait a minute, how are we going to pay for this? This is going to cost about $40 trillion. How do we even come close to paying for this? And she said, well, we'll save $2 trillion by stopping President Trump's tax cuts. It doesn't work that way. When you have tax cuts, the government actually gets more revenue. Every time they try tax cuts, it works, whether it's under a Republican president or a Democratic president, such as John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy famously said, in reference to tax cuts, a rising tide lifts all boats. And instead, when you have a situation where the government just grows and grows and grows, bigger and bigger and bigger, it hurts the little guy far more than it hurts anybody else. And it's at the expense of all the rest of us. Now, in the meantime, the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and the bedroom communities of Maryland and Virginia, which, by the way, they have some of the highest income of any of the zip codes in the whole country, are the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. They love it when the government grows bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's taking away what we're able to do as families and so forth. So bottom line is, if you want to see more abortion, and we pay for it as taxpayers. If you want to see that, then vote in the liberals. If you want to see more socialistic type policies and so forth, vote in the liberals. If you want to convert, all of our medical hospitals to become like the Veterans Administration hospitals, vote in the liberals. But if you don't want to see that, vote conservative. Vote for the biblical values, people.
Let's take some phone calls. I see almost all these on the screen are ones you can answer very well. We'll head to South Carolina first. Anna, you're on with Jerry Newcombe.
Hi, you just touched briefly on the Saul Alinsky topic, and I know that a lot was brought up when Obama was in office about what he was following that was Saul Alinsky, and I just wanted to find out what should we expect? I mean, if they're doing anarchy in the streets, where is that in the process of trying to dismantle our government? Because it just seems to keep getting further and further away from us, and we aren't going to have a conservative in the office forever.
I might just mention, Jerry, you do have some articles and material that's available through D. James Kennedy Ministries on Saul Alinsky, but give us a little bit of an overview. You've been reading him and then seeing the correlation. What do you see? How would you answer Anna's question?
Well, I would say that you're correct, and part of the whole problem is what's been going on in the schools. The schools have, in effect, thrown God out for years, and kids are not able to learn about right or wrong. They're not able to learn about the fact that God will hold us all accountable one day, and so you have basically people who think that might makes right, and so we're back to the Hitler's propaganda minister's comment. History is made in the streets. Well, that's terrible. And Saul Alinsky, by the way, even admitted that he studied under Frank Nitti. Well, I'm from Chicago. Frank Nitti was number 2 from Al Capone. When Al Capone was sent off to prison and ended up in Alcatraz, eventually Frank Nitti was in charge of the Chicago mob. And Saul Alinsky studied under him. It's just like, wow, this is just awful. This is not the way politics should be done in America. And unfortunately, in schools, children are not exposed to the Bible. They don't know about the Bible. They don't know about our history. And you have all these quote-unquote social justice warriors out there, and they think that somehow it's the right thing to do to not only disagree with people, but to shut down those that they disagree with and call them evil. And so I think there's a real culture war in America, and the real ultimate solution is revival.
Yes.
Is Christian revival, is God's Spirit working through his people and lots of people coming to faith in Jesus Christ and having everything be changed from the inside out, including their political perspectives.
You know, we're going to take a break and we'll come back and get some more calls. But if you look at the rules for radicals, there's two that come to mind. One is pick a target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it, you know, and that's that one that he's used for many years. And so you see the polarization that has taken place over the years. And another one of those is ridicule is man's most potent weapon. So you don't just see the polarization of politics, but even the ridicule, and whether it's Saturday Night Live, whether it's the jokes that are being made on the late night talk shows and things like that, a lot of people that are practicing the rules for radicals maybe don't even know who Saul Alinsky is, but they're pushing for that agenda. So if nothing else, that's a little bit of a preview of coming attractions, what we might see after the election next Tuesday. But we have some more questions, which we will ask of Jerry Newcombe right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. America was saddened to learn of the loss of Billy Graham. Some have openly wondered whether history will ever witness another one like him. The better question to ask at this point in our history may be, can there be another Billy Graham? Graham's crusades were public expressions of faith, many times taking place on public property. In 1952, Graham's crusade visited Washington, D.C. Graham held services on the very steps of the United States Capitol, enlisting supportive government officials to secure the permission needed for such an event. He would go on to preach at dozens of the country's most historic and publicly owned venues, including what is today known as Camping World Stadium. In 2015, the football teams from two Christian schools in Florida faced off in that same stadium where, in 1969 and again in 1983, Billy Graham stood to share his gospel message with thousands in attendance. Incredibly, these two religious schools were denied use of the city-owned microphone to pray over the same loudspeaker once used to amplify the disarming baritone voice of Billy Graham as he preached and prayed. If the First Amendment does not protect the right of two Christian schools to pray for 30 seconds over a city-owned loudspeaker in 2015, can it protect the next Billy Graham who wants to use the same public address system in the same stadium? To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back as we continue our conversation with Jerry Newcombe, American Amnesia is the book. And we talked about those first two sections, but the third section relates to something that many of you hear when you're listening online because we play the First Liberty Briefing. And the third section of Jerry's book is Recovering Our Religious Liberty in the Face of a Militant Secularism. And Jerry, before I take another phone call, that's another thing that's at stake. This whole idea of religious liberty, that is one of the reasons why these Senate Judiciary Committee hearings have become so contentious, because in the future we're going to determine whether or not as a Christian, you have to bake a cake, make a floral arrangement, do a photography, painting, whatever it might be, against your religious convictions, or whether or not we still have religious freedom here in America.
That is so true. And America was basically founded by Christians for religious freedom, which they then extended to other groups. And now we find ourselves in a situation where our freedoms are being denied. And I'm glad you played that little audio from Jeremy Dice and the little audio from Kelly Shackelford, both of First Liberty. Kelly Shackelford, of course, being the leader of that. There are a lot of cases that First Liberty and Jay Sekulow and Matt Staver of Liberty Counsel and the Alliance Defending Freedom, and my good friend David Gibbs III of the National Council for Life and Liberty. These different Christian ministries, legal ministries, are on the forefront of helping to preserve our liberty. But it's so important who we vote for, especially in the Senate. For example, the senators decide if they will approve or disapprove of the president's nominees to the courts. Well, a lot of this damage, as you know, Kerby, was done through judges cutting ourselves off from our, actual past as far as the constitutional provisions and so forth, and essentially making up laws that they wanted to have from the bench. So they threw out school prayer and they threw out all kinds of different things because they wanted us to become more secular. Well, that's not how we began. And in fact, as we become more secular, we lose more and more of our rights. Even secular people lose more and more of their rights as we become more secular as a nation. And it's just the way it works, just like the atheist Trotsky had to look over his back and, as the atheist Stalin was chasing him halfway around the world. And finally, one of his minions caught up with him and killed him in Mexico City, or Mexico somewhere. And by the way, my wife is from Norway, and for a couple months, Stalin hid in an island in Norway. I could show you that island. I know where it is. It's off the southern coast of Norway. It's beautiful. But once the Norwegians found out, and once Stalin found out, he gave Norway an ultimatum, give me that guy. And they said, no, but he's not going to stay here anymore. And boom, he went on to Mexico and was killed there. Bottom line is, look, if there is no God, then ultimately all that really matters is whatever power and whatever things you can get in this life. But that's not accurate. That's not true. One day we will all give an account before our lives. And here's a preview of coming attractions, Kerby, for everybody to realize. All of us are sinners, and all of us will have our sin punished. Either you let Jesus Christ receive the due penalty of your sins, or the day will come when, after you die, Jesus Christ will punish you, or, cast you from his presence, and you will be punished for your sins. And that means being separated from the Lord for all eternity. You will miss out on all the great things God has planned for us. And yet Jesus Christ paid the price for our sins on the cross. So those who reject Jesus Christ ultimately are committing what could be called the unpardonable sin. And they will be punished for it, and they will be so sad. They'll be like, why did I listen to the devil? Why was I so stupid? And, and I see us as a nation moving towards the direction of rejecting Jesus Christ and his love for us instead of, moving towards Jesus Christ. This is a nation where we have a national holiday called Thanksgiving, as in thanksgiving to God, because the pilgrims were so thankful to God. Even though half their number had died that first year, they wanted to say thank you to God, and they celebrated even for 3 days, and they invited the Indians, and they had a beautiful time of worship and also Thanksgiving and feast and games. And we still have that tradition of Thanksgiving to this very day. So really, America has a choice. Either we choose God, which, is kind of the foundation, really, of our nation, or we reject that foundation and move towards a secular situation. And look how Nazi Germany was once a formerly Christian country, but it became that, where they took Darwinian thoughts to the nth degree, and they said, okay, some people have evolved more than others. let's create a master race. We'll put Hitler's, we'll put Darwin's ideas, to the ultimate max. We'll create a master race. Look at how it ended. They killed millions of people, not because of what they believed, but because of the blood coursing through their veins. In other words, they were the ultimate racists working for racial purity because they rejected God and they rejected the Christian faith, and they instead said, let's create a master race. Darwin would be so proud of us as we speed up evolution. And all they ended up doing was bringing hell on earth to millions.
Just before we run out of time, let's, if we can, talk about what is on your website, jerrynewcombe.com, because some people might want to get some of your other books. You've talked about everything from Thomas Jefferson, the book that made America, the Bible, how it formed our nation, and many of your other resources. What will they find when they land on your website?
Well, I hope they like what they find. They find radio segments, including ones, there's one with you talking about an evolution finding, very interesting stuff. But I try and do lots of cutting-edge stuff. Speaking of the radio show, I just interviewed recently David Limbaugh talking about his new book about how Jesus is risen from the dead. I also have my weekly column there, plus there are links to the 30-some books that I've had the privilege to write or co-write, including What If Jesus Had Never Been Born, a book I wrote with D. James Kennedy, or George Washington's Sacred Fire, a book I wrote with Dr. Peter Lilback. And you mentioned the Thomas Jefferson. I wrote a book with Mark Belials called Doubting Thomas.
Right.
And it shows some stuff about Thomas Jefferson that 99% of people, probably 99% of even Christians don't know, including a minister that he supported for years. And we have in that book, in the appendix, 2 sermons from that minister, and they're gospel, straightforward gospel preaching. Yes, Jefferson later in life had some serious doubts about some serious core Christian doctrines, but he was not a lifelong skeptic, and he certainly didn't believe in the separation of God and state. And he's the one from which the Supreme Court said the separation of church and state is what we need to impose on America, as opposed to the idea that there'll be no national denomination in America, which is what the founders intended when they gave us the First Amendment.
Well, again, we've had Jerry Newcombe with us. If you'd like to know more about him, we have a link to jerrynewcombe.com. Of course, we have information about this book. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to get this 300 and almost 70-page book, which deals with about 115 different columns that he's written in the past. American Amnesia. Is America paying the price for forgetting God, the source of our liberty? And so just some great material. And Jerry Newcombe, always great to have you on the program with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Kerby. And by the way, I even used that index in the course of this discussion. You would refer to something and, let me look that up real fast. Here it is. Dice, Jeremy, Anderson, Kerby.
Yeah, it's very good. Great material. So again, that's all we have for today. Tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife, Jenny, was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. Medishare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
Medishare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without Medishare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View.